Okay, Mr. Chairman, staff is ready to begin when you are.
Thank you very much, Teresa. I'd like to call to order the Wednesday, June 2nd special meeting of the Public Planning Committee. Teresa, have we complied with the FOIA?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Would you call the roll, please?
Certainly. Ms. Becker?
Here.
Mr. Brown?
Here.
Mr. Stanford?
Here.
Mr. Ames?
And I'm here also. Thank you. And is there a motion to approve the agenda as presented?
So moved.
Is there a second? All those in favor, just raise your right hand, please. Thank you. It's unanimous. Approval of the minutes. I'd like to make one comment. I asked Teresa to change two things on the minutes. On page 2, near the bottom, it refers to the committee. I asked her to clarify that and put public planning in front of it. And then one of the bullets references whether mass development should be allowed in certain areas. I believe the term should be massive, not just mass. So with those changes, is there a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Appreciate that. All those in favor, just raise your right hand, please. Passes unanimously. Thank you very much. Teresa, do we have any comments from the public?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. We do have public comments that were submitted electronically via the Open Town Hall portal. Those comments were provided to the committee for review and made part of the official meeting record. In addition to submitting comments on the portal, citizens were provided the opportunity to call into the meeting to comment. However, we do not have any citizens signed up to speak during today's meeting.
Thank you, Teresa. I would like to recognize and thank the people who provided comments on the town portal. Evidently, or it was obvious that there was research being done, and I appreciate the thoroughness of some of the comments. Thank you very much. Our first order of business is unfinished business, the review and recommendation on family compound, family subdivision, LMO amendments. Dr. DeBose, would you like to make a presentation?
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Sharice DeBose, Historic Neighborhoods Preservation Administrator for the record. I know today you have a full agenda, so I won't take up too much of your time. To recap, in 2019, Town Council voted to approve the Gullah Geechee Project Report Recommendations Framework. And in early 2020, staff began working on the top priority projects, beginning with drafting amendments for the proposed Historic Neighborhoods Preservation Overlay District. The Gullah Task Force recommended that the proposed HNPO district move to the LMO committee in September. The LMO committee made their revisions and recommended that the proposed district move forward to Planning Commission. In preparation for the public meeting in October, letters were sent to affected parties and signs were posted. In early 2021, the Public Planning Committee considered the overlay, made the recommendation that Town Council move forward with the family compound and family subdivision application rather than the entire proposed district. In April, Town Council proposed that family compound and family subdivision amendments be revised to include the Historic Neighborhoods Boundaries District map, just the boundaries map, and languages that specifies that further reductions to buffers and setbacks would require variance from the Board of Zoning Appeals. And also like to take this time to thank you, Councilman Stanford, for working with us on those revisions. Staff returned to the Planning Commission in April because Town Council recommended a text amendment change, which must be reviewed by Planning Commission before it is adopted by Town Council. The Town Attorney Curtis Coltrane reviewed the proposed amendments for family compound and family subdivision, and it was determined that these applications are a use with specific conditions based on the family compound and family subdivision applications are permitted only within the historic neighborhoods. there is a specific definition of family, which is second. And that third thing is that the property must have been owned by the family since 1956. With these revisions, that family compound and family subdivision are a use with specific conditions. This has been added to the use table in the LMO, and another public hearing was required. Because these are text amendments, only a legal ad was necessary rather than the mailings and the postings of signs we saw in October. Planning Commission held their meeting this morning and voted 8-0 to move family compound and family subdivision forward to PPC. The purpose of the family compound and family subdivision is to encourage property retention among native landowners, also to honor the native island communal living traditions. And these property owners can benefit from the compound and the subdivision, and there are some people who are actually waiting to use that now. Staff recommends that PPC forward a recommendation to Town Council for family compound and family subdivision. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. DuBose. I'd like to thank you not only for today's presentation, but also for the work that you've been doing over the last couple of years. And I'd also like to thank staff for its diligence in this matter, and also Curtis Coltrane for his addition to the review in addition to this text over the last month or so. Mr. Brown, your comments?
I echo your gratitude, Mr. Eames. I don't have any additional comments or questions as it pertains to the text. Just ready to move forward.
All right, thank you. Ms. Becker.
I have a question. You've mentioned that there are applicants waiting in queue to take advantage of the changes that would come with this adoption of this. Can you tell me a little bit about those applicants?
Yes, ma'am. Without getting too specific, just that when property owners want to subdivide their property, they want to be able to do so, particularly to build or save a piece for later, where their family members can build down the line. And they want to be able to do that without having to put the entire infrastructure in first, which is what you would have to do if you were doing a regular subdivision. And so this helps alleviate some of the cost of trying to put that infrastructure in first.
So those applicants that you've heard from are looking to create a housing situation for themselves, but aren't necessarily prepared to create the entire infrastructure for what might happen later on the property.
Not at this time. Some will build now, but some they're saving for future to be able to build later.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Those are your questions, Ms. Becker?
Those are my questions.
Thank you very much. Ms. Stanford.
Thank you. Dr. DuBose, I want to echo appreciation that you've heard from others. I particularly want to express my appreciation to you for your patience with me as I have gotten into some of the details and minutia of all of this. But it appears to me that all of the issues that were raised in our last meeting have been resolved through the amendments and the changes that have occurred to date. Has there anything been excluded that we had suggested being done?
No, we were to incorporate the changes that you suggested with the help of Mr. Coltrane.
Good. That's what it's certainly the way it appears. I have one or two other questions. One is, I see that there are provisions in here about requiring a survey, and I see there's a provision in there about title, but I don't know that it is a certification of a fee simple marketable title. Is that true or not?
Say that last portion again, the marketable title?
What I'm getting to is, does someone have to produce a certificate that show that they have the legal title to this property?
Yes, sir, they do. And
Okay.
to be able to make any decisions regarding that property.
Okay, that's good. It's certainly appropriate that that be there. Then the last other question is, I need some clarification on what the changes we've made in this, how those relate to home occupations.
There's nothing with home occupation at this time. That was taken
That's what
out
I
earlier.
thought, but I just wasn't sure. So those, David, those are my questions. There's been an awful lot of work that has gone into this, primarily by the staff, but also some by this committee and others. And I certainly hope that it bears fruit so that we're able to promote home ownership by the Gullah people in this community. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stanford. The only comment I'll make is this has been a process that required the community, the town council, and staff to dig deeper into our relationships on the island. And I'm hopeful, if not optimistic, that this step will prove to be proof of our ability in this community to come together. Is there a motion to approve and recommend to full council what we have seen today and reviewed?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I'll make the motion that we recommend approval by the entire town council of the amendments before us.
Thank you.
And I'll second that motion.
Thank you very much. Teresa, would you call the roll, please?
Yes, sir. Mr. Brown?
Support.
Ms. Becker?
I'm going to vote no, and the reason for that is I think there is still substantial concern with regard to how the reduction in setbacks and buffers will impact adjacent neighbors who will be affected by those decisions. I'm also bothered by a couple of other points within the ordinance that I am not prepared to support at this time. So I'm a no vote.
Mr. Stanford?
For the motion.
Mr. Ames?
I approve. Thank you very much. The vote is 3 in favor, 1 opposed. Next on the new business is a review and discussion on research related to short-term rental ordinance. Ms. Lewis, Deputy Community Development Director, do you have a presentation for us?
Good afternoon, Terry Lewis for the record. Okay, so for short-term rental ordinance, if you will.
Chair, are we amending the agenda or did I miss something?
Did I miss
I've got
something?
item 8A as review and recommendation of the 2020 Low Country Natural.
I appreciate your bringing that up, but what I was sent doesn't have it, although I realize it was on the agenda. Terry, let's go back to the original agenda, which included the low country management.
Yes, sir.
Low country natural hazard mitigation plan. My talking piece didn't include it for some reason. Thank you for pointing that out.
No worries.
So Sherry Mendrick can't join us today, so I am filling in for her. I am happy to go ahead and present the presentation that she had prepared, or I can give you a brief about what this is, and we can move forward from there. Just let me know what you prefer.
I would prefer the short version unless there are questions afterwards by committee members. Just
Absolutely.
give us an idea of what it represents and why it's necessary.
Yes, sir. So the Low Country Council of Governments, LOCOG, on behalf of Beaufort, Colleton, Hampton, and Jasper counties, and then the municipalities within each of those counties, prepared the 2020 Low Country Natural Hazard Mitigation Plan. And what this plan does is it assesses the community's vulnerability to natural hazards and includes long-term strategies to address these hazards and prevent future damage and loss of life. And it's important because the adoption of it will fulfill the continuing requirements that qualify the town for FEMA pre-disaster mitigation grants, post-disaster reconstruction assistance, and then our continued participation in the CRS program. So it's very important. It is consistent with our plan, specifically excellence, environment, regional infrastructure goals and strategies. The Planning Commission met on May 19th to consider it, and they voted unanimously to approve a resolution recommending adoption of the 2020 Low Country Natural Hazard Mitigation Plan as an appendix to our plan. And the next step would be a public hearing before Town Council, and that is scheduled for July 20th if it moves forward with a positive recommendation from Public Planning Committee.
Thank you, Terry. Does any member of the committee have questions for Terry? Seeing none, is there a motion to recommend to the full council approval?
So moved.
Is there a second? Thank you. Second from Ms. Becker. Teresa, would you call the roll? And it's my apology. I found the reference to that item on the agenda. I apologize to you, Teresa. Please call the roll.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Stanford?
For the motion.
Mr. Brown?
Support.
Ms. Becker?
Yes.
Mr. Ames?
Yes. Appreciate
Motion
that.
carries 4-0.
Thank you. Next item is the review and discussion on research related to short-term rental ordinance. Terry, it's all yours. Terry, are you muted?
Oh, I apologize. Let me let Teresa get to the presentation. There we go. Okay. So the development of a short-term rental ordinance has been identified as a priority for the town. Staff and town council members have documented multiple concerns from the public related to the number of short-term rentals that are on the island. Some of these concerns include the impact on neighborhoods, the environment, the infrastructure, also an imbalance between residential versus resort commercial districts. So something that was traditionally a single family neighborhood, as more and more short-term rental units are added to it, it starts to become more resort in nature. There's also a concern with the impact that short-term rental units can have on workforce housing. And some of the other items that we've identified as problematic is just our current definition of dwelling unit, that we don't have a definition of short-term. We have no occupancy limits or limit on the number of bedrooms for single-family homes. And we have no requirement for additional parking at this time. It's based on the square footage of the house, regardless of how it's used. So as you saw from your packet, staff researched multiple communities that had existing short-term rental ordinances. We looked at 24 communities, including several in South Carolina and Florida. We found several commonalities between most of the communities. These include short-term being defined as less than 30 days, that they regulate the number of occupants both by unit and per bedroom, that a license number is required on advertising of the unit, a permit's required, often there's a fee required as well with that permit, business license and associated fee are required, they collect a tax or some sort of occupancy tax, And then also a posting of rules and regulations for the short-term rental, or the provision of what we found was called a good neighbor brochure. Some communities also grandfathered existing rental units, have a primary residence restriction, and use some sort of computer tracking program. And a couple of things with those points. I mean, we would like to get some input from the Public Planning Committee on all of these different things that different communities do, but especially the grandfathering. You know, is that something that the committee would want to consider? If so, we can look at how other communities have done that. Typically, they've only grandfathered it for a certain period of time. And then in terms of the computer tracking program, we found that there was pretty generally just a couple of programs that are out there that are being used to track them, and they can do a lot. Some of them just track the number of units. Some also collect the taxes. But I talked to somebody last week, a representative with one of the main companies that does this, and they did a quick scan of Hilton Head Island using their software and found that there were over 12,000 listings with over 9,500 unique rental, short-term rental units on Hilton Head Island. We also looked at, as we looked at this research and talked to people in other communities, we considered workforce housing and asked how they dealt with that. Was it a concern for them? Several communities we found either included language that short-term rentals cannot be used for or counted towards workforce housing. Others require a fee that goes into a fund that's used to build workforce housing units. Other elements that we found as we were looking at these other communities and talking to people that regulate the short-term rental ordinance were that most require a contact for the unit. It can be the owner, it can be a property management company, but that somebody be available. Some require that somebody's available 24/7. Others require that if there's a complaint, that somebody get back to the complainant within 30 minutes, some up to an hour. They also had regulations related to noise hours, so certain, basically that there would be quiet times, parking spaces based on bedrooms, yearly inspection of the units, specific trash agreements. And I will say that when we've talked to some people in the community, the greatest complaints that we receive are related to noise, not enough parking, and trash. We also found that several communities limited short-term rentals to certain zoning districts. Some went even further than that and limited the use to a certain percentage within zoning districts. And then some have a separation distance between one short-term rental unit and another short-term rental unit. That way an entire neighborhood doesn't become all short-term rental units. In terms of fees, we found that there were vacation rental registration fees, tourist development tax, a per night occupancy privilege charge. We found that in a couple of communities. One charged 50 cents per night per unit, another one was $1. For violations, almost all of the ordinances had some language in there to handle violations. Most involved both a fine and a restriction on using the property for short-term rental after a certain number of violations. So there was often a graduated fine, so it may be $50 for the first violation, $100 for the second. Some of them were more than that, but almost all of them had a restriction that if you received a certain number of violations, you weren't allowed to use your short-term rental, your unit for short-term rental for a period of time. And some of them even had that if you had multiple units and only one had a violation, that violation affected all of them, and you'd be prohibited from doing any of the renting any of those as short-term rentals for a certain period of time. For our next steps, moving forward, we plan to continue to engage stakeholders. We have reached out to all 10 of the planned unit developments. We found that 6 do not allow short-term rentals. Hilton Head Plantation no longer allows short-term rentals, but has 4 that were allowed to remain for an unknown period of time. Palmetto Dunes, Shipyard, and Sea Pines all allow short-term rentals. For Palmetto Dunes, it represents about 50% of the community. Shipyard fluctuates around 300 short-term rental units, and in Sea Pines, there are about 2,000 currently. We also plan to speak with the 3 public service districts and find out their concerns related to short-term rentals, specifically looking to find out the impact on water and sewer capacity. And we plan to engage residents in a variety of neighborhoods to learn about their concerns and experiences related to short-term rentals. Like I said, we have heard comments from different residents in different neighborhoods, but we'd like to reach out and just talk to more people. Our current business license ordinance allows for a 1-unit exemption for people that own and rent property. MASC's business license model ordinance does not have that exemption, and it actually requires all property owners that own and rent property to obtain a business license. Staff is recommending adopting that model business license and removing the 1-unit exemption with the adoption of that new ordinance. And that's scheduled to be reviewed by F&A at their June 15th meeting. We also have an RFQ out right now, which will close on June 10th. We're looking to hire an expert to draft a short-term rental ordinance. We'll share our research with them once they're hired, as well as the input that we receive from the stakeholders and the public planning committee. Staff will work closely through this process, and we would be responsible for taking the drafted ordinance through the adoption process once it was drafted. And certainly we would work very closely with Public Planning Committee and the consultant during that time period. Our plan right now is to report back at the July PPC meeting with an update on the stakeholder input and the status of the consultants. I know that was a lot of information. I know there was a lot that we sent to y'all with the research summary table and the comparison table, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you, Terry. Ms. Becker? You have questions, thoughts?
I definitely have both. First of all, I think this is a long time coming and appropriate that we begin these discussions and start to implement ordinances that will protect our residential neighborhoods, both inside and outside of the gates. Our residents deserve no less than that at this point. The evidence of the destruction to the quality of their lives is brought to our attention on a daily basis. And so I'm happy where we are. I have a question. I have a lot of questions that I think we'll probably have some time to work through. But you specifically asked thoughts with regard to grandfathering. I would want to see how that all fleshes out. But I think the point of this at this stage of the game is to correct where we are, and so grandfathering on a whole scale wouldn't make much sense. So I'd be reluctant to go along with that as it's generally presented now. The RFQ, what is the cost? So that RFQ is simply to draft our ordinance for this? Is that what?
Sure. So we put out an RFQ for an on-call code writer with the idea that whoever we would hire their first task would be to draft a short-term rental ordinance with the expertise that they have, and then potentially work on our future sets of LMO amendments as well.
Okay. Is there a cost that was parameters that was budgeted for? Or?
At this point, we're doing it through qualifications,
Mm-hmm.
and so we don't have a specific cost associated with it yet.
Okay. All right. Well, I am excited to move forward on this, and one of the other points that I wanted to just have you repeat, see if I got it correct. The report that was pulled showed how many active listings and for short-term rentals? 1,200?
Sure. It was a little over 12,000 listings with over 9,500 unique short-term rental units.
I think that is a really important number for us all to keep in mind, why this is so important. I'll let others take a turn. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Becker. Mr. Stanford.
Thank you. Terry, I am very impressed with the detailed research that you've done. It is very helpful and very instructive to see what other communities have done. Um, Being a recovering lawyer, I get concerned about the enforceability of provisions like this. And so I think we need to be careful and make sure that we get adequate legal advice on the legal enforceability of these things. Definition, to me, short-term is certainly about a 30-day rental period, less than a 30-day rental period. Number of occupants, I saw a number of different definitions there, and most of them tend to circulate around 2 people per bedroom plus 2 others. Some limited the others to children. To me, that sort of provision makes a lot of sense given the family vacation nature of this community. Clearly, we need to require a business license of everyone who has a business here of renting real estate on a perpetual basis, that is, on a weekly basis during the high season and so forth. So I would favor getting rid of the exemption of if you're only renting 1 unit. Grandfathering, I would not be in favor of a grandfather provision, but I do want comfort from legal counsel that beginning to impose new restrictions on properties that have been operated on a long-term basis as rentals, that is indeed enforceable. In my mind, it should be enforceable because frequently there are changes in the law and new restrictions are imposed on particular activities. But I want comfort in that. I love the idea of computer tracking on these things. We are fortunate that that has been developed and we can take advantage of that technology. Another thing that I noticed that repeats in these is having a required contact person, in many cases 24/7, who can respond within an hour. Obviously, that would need to be a local person, I think. So that kind of requirement can come a long way to meet many of the objections that we hear. Recently, I've heard from several residents in the Folly Field community complaining about huge groups of people in for wedding parties and so forth. And the sheriff is called. The sheriff shows up. Everybody turns quiet. The sheriff leaves and the party resumes. We need to find a way to deal with that. In the recent presentation that we had from the major here in charge of public service, public safety on the island, I raised that question. They do have a protocol. I would like to see them put that protocol in writing and get some input from the town on that. Noise hours, clearly we need to have some noise hour provisions in this type of ordinance. Enforceability of this is always a challenge, particularly in the really warm weather when people are out in bathing suits and sunning themselves and the like. But we need to have noise controls for the benefit of the residents that are surrounding these properties. Parking has been a gross abuse in the case of short-term rentals. What I have noticed in going through the excellent research is that most of the other ordinances provide for a requirement of 1 parking place per two residents. That seems to me to be reasonable, but they then go further and say no parking on the yard, no parking in the street. If we begin to enforce something like that, some of these mini hotels are not going to be able to operate because they don't have adequate parking. I'm not expressing necessarily sympathy there, but that's where we could run into some legal objections, and we need to get clarity on that. I love the idea of requiring an annual inspection. The inspection goes a long way to make sure that minimum health and safety has been met. I would say that there should be a fee for the inspection so that the town just doesn't incur cost out of our own pocket in conjunction with that. Same sort of thing having to do with trash agreements, requiring that we see a written agreement to provide for trash and garbage collection at these units can save an awful lot of problems that have been faced here in many other ways. I don't think that the idea of requiring a separation of units is practical in this community now at this late date. I look forward to working with staff in moving this ordinance forward and getting it in place so that we can begin to enforce these restrictions. When we do that, we're going to have to give plenty of notice. I think that this ordinance will become effective so that you have to comply beginning, I don't know, pick a date, January 1, 2022, and thereafter. But there needs to be time for current rentals to be absorbed. And then in the case of an overlap, that is a rental that has occurred, in my example, in the last week of December rather, and carries over to the first week, we need to have a way to deal with that and create a waiver having to do with complying for those carryover rentals. So other than that, I don't have much to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Stanford. Mr. Brown, your
Yes,
thoughts?
thank you, Mr. Chairman. Really appreciate Mr. Stanford's legal mind in this whole matter, which I agree with his concerns as we're moving forward. I've been trying to wrestle in my mind as far as directive is concerned, if we are attempting to put the genie back in the bottle, or if we are attempting more of a moratorium, so to speak. And I think that the metrics are important as we move forward. I know that Terry said that they've done a quick scan of the amount of units. Getting a more definitive number, I think, is important to the process. And how that number or how that ratio competes with affordable housing, I think, is important for us also as we press forward with directive. I noticed that there are a lot of, I guess, similarities in some of the case studies that you guys have done, and I appreciate the effort that you've put forward. One commonality that's not laid out in the charts there is that there's been municipalities that have had to revise their ordinance, some in a very short period of time and some over a length of time. I think that shows the importance of us doing our due diligence. I appreciate the fact that we are looking outside to a third party to help us with code, but going back to Mr. Stanford's point, we don't want to run into challenges later that will cause us to have to rewrite something that we put a lot of time into. The whole idea of engaging with the stakeholders, this is just another example of us having balance in our community. Balance between our residents was absolutely come first. And then, of course, our visitors. I I want to make sure that we are equal in representation. There are a lot of fine companies that do short-term rentals very well. And I think that those companies need to be engaged equally so that we are writing code that makes sense. We're writing code that is setting an example. And we're privy to that information so that we're making better decisions long term here. So I'm definitely excited about the path forward. As mentioned before, this is a long time coming. We need to get a handle on it. But again, the metrics and the engagement, to my mind, are definitely the most important pieces. That's all I have at the moment, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Mr. Harkins, you're probably acting as a adjunct here. Do you have comments that you'd like to add?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm here today on an educational mission to learn more about the situation, but I do have some thoughts. We talk frequently about the character of the island, and we talk about preserving the ambience that's so important to us. And I'm concerned that short-term rentals, absent good guidelines, if not very detailed requirements, we can be in a situation that really challenges us to maintain the island the way we would like it. And I think a laissez-faire approach is not smart. And I question legally what we can do in doing a retrospective review, but something needs to be done. And I think those are my comments right now. I'm here to learn, to listen. I really would like to have more detail about other communities similar to ours that have wrestled with this and what they've been able to do about it. And I think in terms of the data package, as we look at this, it's going to be important to really realize the economic cost as well as the benefit of the existing situation. So we have a reference point as we go forward. Those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Harkins. And if you haven't done it already, go to the agenda package in the Public Planning Committee for today's meeting, and you'll be able to pull up staff's very extensive research on 24 different communities as far away as Hawaii, but as close as Bluffton. It was very well done, and there is a matrix that shows some of the commonalities among those 24.
Thank you. I look forward to reviewing that material. I appreciate that.
Good. My reaction to this conversation is more visceral than our thoughtful attorney, Mr. Stanford, who looks at it in a much, much different way through a different lens. And I think it's important that we have his lens. But let me give you my reaction. I've been under the impression that we've had 6,500 short-term accommodations plus hotels. But today we are told that there are 9,500 units, and I'm guessing that might include timeshares. And I don't understand what 12,000 listings means. Terry, can you clarify those 2 points, please?
Certainly, I'll do my best. My understanding from talking to the person that ran the numbers was that when they did it, they came up with a little over 12,000 residents that could be used as short-term rentals, and that unique number comes out of where something may be listed twice in a different, a different software program. And so they drill it down to get the actual, they not only use software to do this, but they have actual people reviewing the data as well, so that they have a more specific number of short-term rental units for a
And
community.
the 9,500 would include timeshares? Is that?
I'm jotting that down as a question to ask. I'm not sure. We didn't talk about timeshare units, so,
Okay.
but I'll find that out.
Those are very significant numbers. And I heard somebody say, I'm not sure we can put the genie back in the bottle. I think a lot of things have to change in the community. And in some ways, we have to think about what's the economy of our tourism industry here on the island. And the more units we have for short-term rental, the more impact we'll have on our infrastructure, our amenities, our roads, and so on and so forth. And also, I believe, if that trend occurs, values per night are going to go down. And so I think that there is a strong case for our using whatever means we have to begin to pare down that number of 9,500 to the best units that provide the greatest experience for our visitors. And so that also plays into this housing issue. So many of our short-term rentals today used to be our less expensive long-term accommodations for workers and residents. And so I think there really truly is a much more profound relationship between a rental ordinance that we're talking about and our quality of life, our basic economy, and the experiences for residents. I would commend staff for outlining sort of the status situation, safety, land use incompatibilities, neighborhood protection, so on and so forth. But the one that I keep coming back to, because it has so much to do with the value of the experience for guests and the quality of life for residents, is that protection of brand, the reputation that draws people here every single week. And so the experience that people have when they come to this island, if we're not careful, some of those 9,500 units are not going to provide that kind of experience. So town policy that I see, and much of this has already been thought about, the definition of short-term rentals. Is it just 30 days, or is it acknowledging that there is a commercial component to short-term rentals that may have an impact on how we handle the situation? Licensing fees, we're moving ahead in that direction. Occupancy limits. I was taken by some of the examples that it was 2 persons per bedroom or 10 maximum. And so I think what we ought to do, Terry, is take a look at our significant numbers, are the rental stock that we have that are in very large homes and in large, I guess mainly large homes, the mini hotels, and see what they are advertising. Because I think if they are advertising 24, then there is an opportunity for the town to look at that number and, in a sense, connect it to the impact on our infrastructure and amenities. I think that's an important connection. Grandfathering, I think that's a legal issue. I think that we probably have to acknowledge that somebody who's been doing business gets to do it for a period of time, but I don't have the legal mind or the experience to say much more about that. Enforcement and town costs. I think that's going to be an issue for us to wrestle with very early. For us to have a rational and dependable rental policy and ordinance, we're going to have people working on town staff to handle that. I don't see how we're going to do it in any other way. And so we need to balance the cost of doing something we'd like to do versus a different policy. I think one of the things that is important to residents who live in communities that are beginning to feel the transition to short-term rentals is there an opportunity to designate more residential areas today and somehow have an overlay capping the number of short-term rentals within those areas, or conversely encouraging them to be in certain areas. That has a lot to do with license fees and other fees that might be involved. Violations, I think that has a lot to do with enforcement, but how are we going to designate what is a violation? And then I've already mentioned residential versus commercial. We really are dealing with commercial entities. And I don't know what that means in terms of taxes or treatment within the town. But what is occurring is that Hilton Head Island has created a reputation of value, and people are taking advantage of that reputation as it would be expected. But I'm not sure we're getting a appropriate return on that investment of brand that we have. And so I am looking at how we recognize the platform or the structure that this town has created for all those short-term rentals to prosper. So definitions, 30 days, whether or not transient, yes on fees and license. I think information within the unit, code of conduct, good neighbor policy, who to contact, safety issues, emergency numbers, and so on and so forth. We should, to the best of our capability, should treat each and every person who comes into one of those as our guest, and try to have communication that recognizes them as a guest and provide them information in a way that they feel like a welcome guest. Occupancy based on the square footage or maximum occupancy, I think that's really key. I'm not sure we have the information to be able to make a good judgment at this time, but the issue of parking relates to the number of people that are in a unit, and somehow we have to bring that together. Parking is an issue, and I wonder when Glenn said, I'm not sure that we can do too much on that. I think our town codes and parking restrictions probably say something about that will give us some capability to deal with it. But to some degree, I like the idea of no parking on grass and so on. So I'm open to that conversation. I like the idea of Granicus or Citizen Serve, the tracking, the computer tracking. I think that's very critical, both from a tax fee situation, but also providing town council an idea of how many people are coming to the island over a period of time. I haven't heard anything about liability insurance, fire insurance, or anything like that. I just asterisk that, as seems to me if we're worried about safety, probably ought to have something in there about that. Required in advertising. Do you remember back in March when we were in April, when we were trying to deal with short-term rentals because of COVID? And it was an eye-opening experience to see what people were saying about Hilton Head Island and what they could expect. So I think some requirement in advertising we ought to think about as well. So those are my thoughts at this time. Again, I will say that I'm looking at this perhaps somewhat more emotionally, economically, from a brand standpoint. And I think that 9,500 units is a number that we ought to consider, whether or not it's doing the best for our reputation, and create a code and an ordinance that gets us to the place we want to be. Thank you, Terry. Are there any other, yes, go ahead, Glenn.
I was just going to comment. I see Tom Lennox lurking in the background here. I didn't know whether Tom had any input to put on this.
Oh, I didn't see him. Tom, you there? He's only lurking. Oh, okay.
Yes, yes, I'm watching on the road.
Oh, okay.
I'll have some comments once I have the benefit of reading the materials.
All right. Thank you, Tom. Before we move on to the next agenda, okay, go ahead.
I just wanted to follow up, David, because I was listening with interest to what everyone had to say. And I think there's an awful lot of concern and thought with regard to this topic of short-term rentals that we all share. What I'm hoping comes out of it, from what I understand, have experienced, and hear, is that the focus becomes one of protecting our neighborhoods, protecting our residents and their investment in their full-time properties on Hilton Head Island where they spend their time. Those who visit and have second homes here, I'm sure, are equally affected. Those who buy properties, multiple properties often, and never spend any of their vacation or their primary residential time on Hilton Head have taken advantage of our neighborhoods. And it's time, I think, to, in fact, put that genie back in the bottle to the best extent that we can. Some of the codes, some of the construction and development that has happened in a way that now sacrifices safety because there is not sufficient parking for the sizes and the structures that are built within these residential homes. And so, to me, it's obvious that in a residential neighborhood, none of us want people parking on our yards, our neighbors' yards, and the rest. So there has to be appropriate and adequate parking if you're going to rent your home out in such a manner. The noise is clearly disruptive to everyone. So every one of these topics that y'all were very, very carefully describing needs to be added to the list and thought through. But I think it all can be summed up in returning our residential neighborhoods back to the residents of Hilton Head Island and protecting their quality of life, as well as the safety of each and every person who enjoys the island along the way. So I just want to make sure that that remains our focus, that all the details get pulled out, that we look at them, that they're legally sound, et cetera, all of that, but that we keep a focus on what the purpose of this really intends to be. So thank you, and I appreciate this conversation. I look forward to it quickly moving forward, and I'm here to help in any way.
Thank you, Tammy. Alex, Glenn, any parting comments? No?
I think this has been a good discussion. Terry has one or two notes there, I noticed, and we look forward to working with you and developing this moving forward. Thank you.
Good. Terry, do you have any questions of us, clarification?
No, I did want to assure you that one of the requests in the RFQ that's out is to have a lawyer as part of the team that works on this ordinance. And then we've also, we would also have Curtis review anything that was drafted. So we will definitely do that. I did want to acknowledge, because it was a lot of research, a lot of putting that together. And so Jamie Lobko and Nicole Dixon were key to getting that put together. And then just related to the insurance question that you brought up, I didn't have that in my presentation, but we did find that in other communities where they were required to carry a certain amount of insurance on those properties. So we'll look at that as well.
Good. Thank you, Terry, and good job, and thanks for those who helped you get the amount of research done. It was voluminous. Thank you. All right.
Thank you all for your input.
Next, a review and discussion of the 2021 LMO amendments, the first set. And Terry, you leading off?
Yes, I am going to start that discussion as well. All right. So as you know, the LMO is generally amended on a biannual basis with some standalone amendments that proceed separately due to town council priorities. We did adopt the town council adopted several sets of amendments in 2020, but we put general amendments on hold during that time. And we've gone back and prioritized that list, and we're ready to bring forward the first 14 for consideration at this time. And so I do want to talk first about the standalone amendment. So as you see in what was submitted to you as part of the packet for standalone, obviously the short-term rental ordinance. We're also looking at amending our wetland mitigation requirements for projects that have a community benefit. And examples of those would be the airport, the Gateway Corridor project, and parks. What we found is that there's kind of a double fee, a double dipping, if you will, when it comes to wetland mitigation, with the state requiring a certain payment in an off-island mitigation bank. And then per our own LMO, we also require wetland mitigation either on site, in a watershed on the island, or a fee in lieu of. So an applicant ends up having to pay twice in some way. And so we're looking for ways to fix that, but still protect the environment on Hilton Head Island. So you'll see that coming forward. Changes to massing height, setbacks, and buffers. These are what, in the last meeting that we had with the Public Planning Committee when the DRB participated in that conversation, that will be coming forward. And then finally, the airport approach path and incompatible uses within that approach path. That's something that the airport's director has asked us to take a look at. And so we would be bringing that forward as well at some point. We're going to take this, the first set, the 14 proposed amendments. I'm going to talk about the first one. I'm going to turn it over to Nicole Dixon to go through some of them, and then I'll pick back up at number 9. And what we're going to do is there's nothing drafted at this point. This is just us going through and prioritizing our list of proposed amendments, talking to our interim community development director about them, and then bringing them forward to the Public Planning Committee at this point. So before any research would start, any drafting would start, that we could get some, some indication of support or, extra input from the Public Planning Committee. So the first one that I'll talk about would be make changes identified that are needed as a result of the new flood maps. As you know, we just adopted the new flood maps in March. As part of that, we made some changes to both the LMO and the municipal code. We've identified that there are some minor changes to language that is needed just to clarify based on some questions that we're getting from surveyors and the public. And so we recognize that we need to go back and just make sure that that's clear so that so that people are able to submit the correct information right from the start. And so we'll be bringing that forward as part of the first set.
Terry, is that more an administrative need than a substantive need?
Yes, it's more of a clarification of language.
Okay, thank you.
All right, and now I'm going to turn it over to Nicole Dixon for the next few.
Yeah, members of the committee, if you have a question, please just raise your hand if we want to interrupt at any point. Thank you. Go ahead, Nicole.
Thank you. Good afternoon. So as Terry mentioned, I will go through the next several amendments listed in your packet. The first one, add a definition for nano brewery and add to the use classifications. This is one that came as a suggestion from the Board of Zoning Appeals. The LMO does not currently contain a definition for nano brewery. Staff previously considered it most similar to a manufacturing type use. but an appeal of staff's determination was overturned by the BZA, who considered it less intense than a manufacturing use and more similar to a restaurant or bar use. Their suggestion was to add a definition to the LMO as well as to the use classifications so that staff and the public are clear what zoning districts this use is permitted in.
Nicole, have you given this any thought? Is there a downside in moving this in this direction that you have identified, or are you and staff looking at this as probably making sense?
I think it makes sense for the scale of the use. So if it's a nano brewery that's limited in size, and we can draft or create the language in the definition of what that is so that it is limited in scope and size. Obviously, if it was a full-scale brewery, it would be considered manufacturing. So I think it makes sense as to BZA's direction on this one.
Do any members of public planning have a comment on this particular item?
No, I recall that BZA hearing and heard the arguments at that time.
Thank you.
What's the definition of a nano brewery in your mind?
It would be a small, I mean, I don't have a definition in front of me. There are standard definitions for a nano brewery, and it would be something that's small in scale, limited to the amount of sales and limited to a specific amount of maybe on-site consumption, and maybe if they offered something, like eating and beverage services on site within the establishment.
Okay.
So it'd be more similar to a bar or restaurant type of use and not so much of the production.
Thank you.
Okay, go ahead, Nicole.
Great. Number 2, allow outdoor screened bike storage in the light commercial and community commercial zoning districts and provide more specificity related to screening. This is another one that is a result of a BZA meeting where a variance was approved for outdoor storage of a bike business. The BZA questioned why the LC and CC are the only zoning districts that allow bike shops but don't allow them to have outdoor storage. So staff is suggesting allowing outdoor storage as long as it's screened from view, and is also looking to potentially add more specificity related to the screening, such as limiting the size and location of the storage on a lot.
Any thoughts by members? Yeah, the only concern I would have is any trees. How the site is impacted by having outdoor storage. I think it makes sense to allow it. Distance from road, screening, buffers, things like that, all become a part of the puzzle. So.
Right, and we would require a development plan review for any business that would want to have the outdoor storage, and we would require that they maintain the adequate and appropriate buffers and setbacks, and that they screen it from view, whether it's with a fence or landscaping.
Would that also go through DRB?
If it's in the corridor overlay, yes, ma'am, it would.
Okay. Any other comments on that one? Seeing none, you can go ahead, Nicole. Number 4.
The next one is allowing outdoor display and sale of merchandise in the resort development, Mitchellville, and Marshfront zoning districts. The RD, MV, and MF zoning districts do not currently allow outdoor display of merchandise, but they do allow some uses such as open air sales and bike shops with outdoor storage. And so because these uses are so similar, staff would like to consider allowing outdoor display of merchandise in these districts.
Is that a staff originated idea, or have you been requested to look into that by landowners?
We've had applicants request to have outdoor display, and in trying to explain what districts it was allowed, they were questioning why they can have a bike business out there with outdoor storage but not have any kind of outdoor display. And so in looking at it and looking at the different districts and what's allowed, it was just staff found that it was appropriate to be able to allow that in those districts.
I'm concerned about this one.
Okay. I agree with you, David. I'm concerned about it as well.
Why don't you cite your concern and then I'll follow you.
Well, simply put, I think that if anything, that list of what's allowed should be more refined and tightened before we end up with something that becomes wholly unmanageable and varied and has an aesthetic. It doesn't aesthetically fit in with what we want to see around the island. And so I would prefer a more restrictive list than a more broad list be created, so that there's no question if there was an appeal that they're so similar, then of course this should or could be grouped in together. I'd go back and make it far more tight and distinct with what is allowed and what is not allowed.
And I also think that whether it is permanent or temporary is an issue. I think that what comes to mind when I see outdoor display and sale of merchandise is driving down the road and seeing shirts hanging on metal. It's going in a direction that I think may cheapen the island rather than enhancing it. So I'd be very careful on that one. Any other comments from people? Glenn?
I fear the constant issue that we hear, that is, we're turning into another Myrtle Beach.
Yeah.
I can picture on Myrtle Beach, t-shirts hanging outside, sunglasses outside, tights, whatever. So I agree, we need to be very careful about how we deal with this one.
Let me make a recommendation. If Alex, I'm sorry, were you about to say something?
Yes. I guess my comment is definitely one of balancing. I guess I'm looking at it through a couple of lenses here. I definitely can appreciate not having items placed outside of storefronts. At least, for my business, that's tough to see, particularly in certain areas of the island. So, in that instance, I can appreciate the wanting to control it, but I also have to view it from a lens of those that are wanting economic opportunity without the storefront ability. The Gullah Geechee Task Force recommendations speak to that, and I don't want us to be so stringent to where we are now not allowing open air sales in areas that we have collectively said may need some of the restrictions loosened so that they can be sustainable economically. So, there's a fine line in balancing this. So, more discussion to come. I just needed to make that point.
I appreciate that. And yeah, there's probably some middle ground in here. Special events, I think that things that bring interest to the community or display our culture may have a place, but I think my gut is telling me that we have to be very careful how we treat RD, MV, and MF zoning districts with outdoor display and sale of merchandise. So I'd be cautious on that one, Nicole. And I think again, temporary displays are different than permanent displays. And how to deal with Alex's suggestion needs thought as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
I would just reiterate and play the contrarian devil's advocate on that economic opportunities are important for everyone, but also maintaining our brand and what our island represents. It needs to be the focus of making sure we're a cohesive island, once again, not separating or changing ourselves, but really focusing in on what makes us special as the town of Hilton Head Island and what our history as an island has developed us into with regard to all of that. So real important to make sure that we keep all of that in focus. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate the
Thank you,
feedback.
Nicole. Go ahead.
Okay, the next one is revise what is permitted to encroach into setbacks. This one in particular, we've heard from several members of town council that we should not allow HVAC units and other utility type cabinets to be located within a setback. As a result, we are considering a full review of the setback encroachment table and potentially listing what cannot be located within the setback. Staff would also like to consider allowing an in-ground pool to be permitted to encroach up to 10 feet in the adjacent use setback, as it's allowed to do in the adjacent street setback. Currently, in the adjacent street setback table, structures that are less than 24 inches in height only have a 10-foot adjacent street setback. So staff's heard from several developers, we're not going to put a pool in the front yard. Why is it allowed in the front yard? Why can't we have it in the back if it's in ground? So that's something that staff would also like to consider. And so for this one, we're looking for direction from you all on any kind of changes to the setbacks encroachments.
Comments from committee? Glenn?
Yes. In the past week, I've heard from a number of residents in one of the new communities here wanting an in-ground pool. I'm willing to look at the pluses and minuses of this. I see great value, obviously, in our setbacks and buffers, and we don't want to be abusing that. But going back to my BZA days, frequently that was the request for a variance. And it's because people feel like they ought to be able to do things like that. We have our rules. Let's review our rules and make sure they make sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn. Alex? No comment? Tammy?
I don't have any comment at this time.
Tom, I've been leaving you out because I don't see your face on the screen. Do you have any thoughts you want to add to any of this?
I think he's driving.
Yeah. Okay. What's the purpose of a setback? What's the purpose of a buffer? And I think we are seeing development on this island that doesn't respect the reason we have setbacks and buffers. Basically, it's a clear-cutting subdivision, and the only thing that is left is this artificial dimension, 10 feet, 5 feet, whatever it might be. I think if we are going to be looking at setbacks, I think we also have to think about what's the purpose of a setback. It's supposed to be allowing vegetation to protect you from, or to protect neighbors from one another. It has some environmental reason, I'm sure. It's hard to believe based on clear cutting what it is afterwards. But so Nicole, I think it's good to clarify what is permitted in the setback. But I think we really also have to look at answering the question, what's the purpose of a setback? Does it serve an environmental purpose? And if so, what are we trying to include in our LMO that reinforces that notion? So setbacks, buffers have a purpose. It's just not a artificial dimension. Thank you.
Thank you.
Go ahead with the number 6, please.
is another one where we talk about setbacks and buffers. So the first bullet, add the PD1 district and agricultural use category to the adjacent use setback and buffer tables. I believe this was just inadvertently left off. The PD1 district isn't listed in the tables for adjacent use setback and buffer, neither is the agricultural use category. So just for clarification and, to make it more clear to the public and staff how to enforce this, staff is recommending that this be added to those tables.
Any comments? Okay, go ahead with next.
The next bullet is to mirror the reduction that's allowed in the setback table for small residential development plan reviews and minor subdivisions in the buffer table. So currently, small residential developments, which are 2 through 5 homes on one lot, and minor subdivisions, which are 5 lots or less, are permitted to reduce their boundary adjacent use setback by 50%. And it was inadvertently left off the buffer table to be able to do the same with buffers. Now, while the LMO currently allows 2 different types of buffers, so the narrowest would be if you have a 20-foot buffer, you can use a type 2, which would be a 10-foot buffer option. But the applicant, in order to use that type, would need to demonstrate that they have enough plantings to meet that buffer type. So this is more geared towards commercial type development. Staff does not think it was the intent for minor subs or small residential developments for them to consider planting additional trees and vegetation in their buffers. So staff is looking to just mirror the language that's allowed for the setback in the buffer table. That way it's clear to applicants.
Well, may I jump in because that wasn't clear to me. So are you saying that what's currently in the code was really actually just intended for commercial properties and not necessarily?
No. So what's currently in the code is there's an allowance for a reduction in the setbacks for small residential developments and minor subdivisions. So the boundary setback can be.
Are there criteria? Are there criteria in terms of what accounts for when that reduction can take place, or is that a judgment call?
No, there's no criteria. It just specifically states that for small residential developments and subdivisions, that the boundary adjacent use setback can be reduced up to 50%. So there's no kind of waiver or they have to meet certain conditions in order to be able to do that. It's just for those types of applications, they only are required to provide a 10-foot setback. And so it just makes sense that the buffer is allowed to be reduced to 10 feet as well. And that's how staff's been interpreting it, because the buffer table allows for a 10-foot buffer if they use the option 2. And so just to make it clear for staff and for applicants what we're requiring, we're just looking for clarification with this one.
I would go the opposite direction than the one it seems we're heading in.
Bill?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the point is well made that, absent criteria, we're going to be doing ad hoc reviews in perpetuity. And when I think of setbacks, I think of the criteria that are important to me. And if they're important to all of us, they can become criteria or a screen. Certainly, privacy, I think we'd all agree, is an important reason for a setback. I think we would all agree that aesthetics is important for a setback. I think we would all agree that noise is another reason for a setback. I think another more amorphous would be adding, frankly, to the quality of the asset that's being built and nurtured and maintained. And, going back to that swimming pool situation, I can just think of all the swimming pools I've had for my family over the years, and they're noisy, noisy places. when all the kids jump in. That's great. But if you're next door looking for a peaceful vacation, that variance didn't help you too much. So my respectful suggestion is let's wrestle with criteria that can be universally applied. In the presence of those, the earlier discussion on AC units would never be allowed in a setback. Those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Glenn?
Thank you. I'm inclined to lean the way Tammy is speaking to this, and that is we need to preserve and protect buffers, not be reducing them. There's been a lot of conversation here about island character. To me, the narrower we have buffers, the closer we have homes, the less Hilton Head-like it is. And so I think we need to be very careful with this. And Nicole, I would ask you when you're coming back with details on this to show us some real world examples of these, some photographs that really help. I mean, sometimes we have to imagine these things,
Right.
and some people are better at it than I am for sure. So that'll be very useful, but I want to be treading very carefully going through this one. Thank you.
Alex, anything? No? If you allow a housing developer, tract developer, to build a bigger house and have to put in a few plants to get a quote unquote acceptable buffer, I think that you go in the wrong direction. The vegetation that is planted is usually small gallon containers without irrigation. It's not going to create the kind of environment that I think we are striving to attain. So I think this is going in the wrong direction. And as a matter of fact, as we go through the rest of these, I almost might suggest that we look at the entire bucket list of these and have the Public Planning Committee look at them as a body. But let's go ahead and remove note. Go on to the next bullet point.
So the next one is to remove the note in the setback table and the note that's underneath the setback table that allows small residential development and minor subs to reduce their boundary setback to 5 feet. So the way that the LMO currently reads is that the boundary setback of a minor sub or small residential development can be reduced by up to 50%, but no less than 5 feet. And so the smallest setback width is 20 feet. Reducing that 50% would get you to 10 feet. Currently, there's the option to reduce it an additional 10% if certain criteria are met. So the smallest the setback would ever get to is 9 feet. It would never get to a 5-foot setback on the boundary. So this language to staff is misleading. So staff is looking at removing that reference.
Thoughts?
Same thing we've been talking about buffers all along.
I suggest we follow through with your suggestion that we take the setback and buffers as a body of, and review it in its total form and see what we like and what we don't. Bill's points were very precise, and I think we all can agree that they were completely accurate and should be discussed fully.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Nicole.
Okay.
So I think even the last bullet, we can wait until we look at the bigger picture.
Okay.
Now, out of curiosity, who expressed an interest in having these changes? Was it staff or was it somebody from the outside?
So I would say probably a little bit of both. What we've done what we typically do is whenever we either get an inquiry or a complaint from the public, we keep a spreadsheet of potential LMO amendments in the future. So whenever we get any kind of, or continuously get concerns about the same thing, we add it to the list. And then some of this is coming from staff, where we've reviewed something, we've reviewed a project and found, say the 5-foot setback thing. I think that was a staff initiated, or that extra 5 feet was a staff initiated amendment, because like I explained, you would never get to a 5-foot setback anyway. And so in reading the LMO, it's misleading to say no less than 5 feet.
Yeah, I understand. I think that so much of this is like a pendulum swinging. We have seen over the last 5 to 8 years a significant increase in tract housing on Hilton Head. And I think that my gut reaction, and I think that is shared by others, is that maybe this is going in a direction that devalues the reputation and Hilton Head brand, and we need to do something about it. So that's essentially what number 6 is in my way of thinking. Thank you, Nicole.
You're welcome.
Number 7?
So number 7 is dealing with access easements, and again, this is probably gonna, because it relates to setback and buffers, you might want to clump it in with the last set, but staff continuously hears complaints about having to provide a setback and buffer from access easements. So this is another one where staff was recommending adding a column into the adjacent street setback and buffers tables, and have a specific requirement just for access easements, and potentially have a reduced width. So instead of a 20-foot setback and buffer from an access easement, maybe narrow it down to 15 or 10 feet.
Give me an example of what you're talking about. An access easement to a commercial property or a condominium?
This is typically for residential. So if you have a minor subdivision, or say you have a row of 3 to 5 lots, and you've got an access easement that serves those properties. So an access easement is required to be 20 feet wide. And so you've got your string of homes, and then you've got your 20-foot access easement that runs through those homes. Well, then you're required to have a 20-foot setback and buffer on both sides of that access easement. So it really eats up a big portion of the property. And so if you're dealing with small lots, and in some of the native island communities, I know Mr. Brown, we've talked about this in particular with some properties where it really creates unusable lots. If you provide your 20-foot access easement, and then you have 20-foot setback and buffers on both sides, you're limited to the building area.
Okay, unless somebody disagrees, I think we do lop it into the other conversation.
I think we absolutely lop it into it. Another perfect example of an access easement with a severely reduced buffer is on Bradley Circle, where there's a 1-foot setback off of, and a 4-foot on the other side off of the access easement. It creates an incredibly dangerous situation for both cars, pedestrians, fire and rescue. Aesthetically, it's a mess, and the list goes on. So it should be very well reviewed.
Okay, thank you. Number 8.
And this is the last one that I'm going to review with you. Again, dealing with buffers. For years, probably for as long as I've been with the town, we require that landscaping and plantings be installed on the lots before issuing a CFC. And as part of that CFC process, staff goes out and inspects, make sure that the landscaping's been installed in accordance to the approved plan. And we've received many complaints over the years that the landscaping is then destroyed right away once they start building the homes, and that they would like us to change the process to require the landscaping be installed for each lot after the home is complete, prior to issuing the CO on the permit. And this is one that we're looking for direction from you all on. since the adoption of the revisions to the LMO last year pertaining to greater protection of trees and buffers, we've received a lot of complaints that it's impossible to build on the lot right up to their buffer line if they have to install tree protection and preserve the trees in the buffer, because building up to their buildable area will destroy the buffers. A potential solution would be to require an additional setback from the buffer line, similar to what's required for wetland buffers, where if there's a 20-foot wetland buffer, for example, there is an additional 5-foot setback from that buffer to lessen the chances of destroying or limiting disturbance in the buffer. That was something that staff was looking at as a potential solution to this, but we continuously hear these complaints. I've got a 20-foot buffer. I'm allowed to build right up to that line, but now I've got this tree protection that I'm required to have up. How am I supposed to build my home?
Yep.
So this is, another one where staff's looking for policy direction on these.
Okay, comments by members? Glenn?
Tree protection trumps those arguments, in my opinion. We're all about tree protection in this community, and those are our rules, and you build in accordance with our regulations. Thank you.
Tammy?
I agree. I'd also like to be certain, because it's not always the case, that a planting requirement has been made part of the plan. So that just brings up that point as well. But Glenn is absolutely right.
Anyone else? I have a comment on this one, and it comes from some practical experience. If the buffer has no trees in it at the beginning of construction of the house or the building, then I would agree and support the position that the planting could take place after the construction. There are too many things that go on in a building site. So putting in a bush or a tree in the buffer and then trying to protect it during construction doesn't make sense to me. However, if there is natural vegetation in that buffer, then it should be protected. So to me, it's two different cases. I think to the degree that we can be requiring the protection of our buffers, then they truly are buffers. If we can't, and they're clear cut, then I think the planting can come in after construction. But those are two very distinct differences. One, how do we protect natural vegetation if it's there? And two, if we have allowed clear cutting or there is no vegetation, then how do we plant effectively and cost effectively afterwards? So, all right. Number 9 was Terry.
Yes, thank you. So number 9 comes out of the Gullah Geechee Preservation Report. One of the recommendations was to allow temporary or seasonal signage as a part of that report. And so I met with staff and we looked at the existing LMO in the sign section to see if there was any way to allow this right now, and there really isn't without changes to it. And so that's why we would bring this forward. We are looking at, possibly considering some of the similar conditions that we had in family compound, family subdivision amendments related to, part of a historic neighborhood, but we haven't started to draft anything yet. That's just an idea related to that, but it did come out of that Gullah Geechee Preservation Report.
Okay, thoughts? Tammy?
I think Bill's hand was up first.
Bill, go ahead.
Oh, it's all right. I just think maybe a little bit humorous, but one season we're all very familiar with on this call is the election season. And when you start to think of signage being used during the election time and all the difficulty that creates for the town staff, that has to be taken into consideration too.
Right.
Tammy?
And along the same lines and the same, you know, it's all a matter of the aesthetics. It's all a matter of the scene that we want to see. Do we want to drive down our roads and see a variety of different signs, temporary or not? Hilton Head is not known for that. And I actually, for one, am going to try to preserve that as part of what Hilton Head stands for. The nice, clean look. I'm looking forward to the revitalization of our landscape and that to continue. To start to continue a more scenic look of clean, natural experience along our roadways, and signage, additional signage, is not going to help that at all. So I'm not in favor of this idea.
Thank you. Glenn?
Thank you. I need to see an explanation of the reason that this is in the Gullah Geechee report and what the intended uses would be. But assuming that we agree with that idea, there needs to be some method of assurance that that signage will in fact be removed. Many times temporary signs in other communities go up and they just stay there until Mother Nature brings them down. We don't want that here for sure. Thank you.
Alex, do you want to add anything? Alex, are you muted?
I'm kind of squirming in my seat here because I'm trying to get a place of comfort here versus, I guess, almost a feeling of not being wanted. There's a lot of talk about island character, a lot of talk about history. And when it comes to a Gullah Geechee recommendation, there's no I guess the best way to say it, there's no acknowledgement of that history and that culture being here before Fraser's vision. Some could really take it as being offensive, to be honest with you. Our island character includes the Gullah culture. I hate to say it out loud, but it's the truth. It's spelled out in our new comprehensive plan. So to mention that something that a Gullah is asking for is out of character, it is overreaching to a degree. But I will try to make my point here as to why this is needed. We have stood up as a municipality and said that we want to preserve the Gullah culture here on Hilton Head, and we all know that the land is so ultimately important to that preservation. So in a sense, we're saying that a for sale sign in front of a Gullah property for a period of time is okay. But if I decide to plow my front yard and grow some watermelon and put up a for sale sign this summer that I want to sell watermelons, fresh homegrown watermelons, that's out of island character. Again, ladies and gentlemen, some sensitivity to what is on the ground, what has been on the ground, is important to us balancing along the way. That's why this was put in, because they are individuals that still farm their land and would like to sell fresh items seasonally. I'll stop there, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Alex.
So I just want to take a second and address, so with no disrespect to anything that as you've described, just want to make clear that I didn't hear the comments addressing those concerns that you had. Had they, that would have been a different conversation. So I'm happy to sit aside with you and have that conversation. What my point was and is that the aesthetics of the island on a routine basis does, in my opinion, at this point, quite honestly, is littered with signs. We have signs in before and after every crosswalk. We have signs about, we have stop signs, we have nature signs, we have signs everywhere. And those, in my opinion, are already too much and don't necessarily represent what it is that we have always expected to see as we go down our roads. And I think our neighborhood, our entire community neighborhood, from the beginning of the bridge to Sea Pine Circle and all in between and all around, deserves the very best appearance that we can give to it and thoughtfulness at each and every decision that's made that impacts each and every resident and visitor alike. And so that being my point, the addition of more signs is not something that I personally think will benefit us in that way. But
let me jump in here, Alex. There were very few signs on Hilton Head in 1973 because there were very few people on the island. Today, we have 40,000 people living here and probably on average 40,000 people visiting. And so if we didn't want signs proliferation, we needed to keep the island smaller, fewer visitors. And yeah, I agree with you, Tammy. We've got too many signs. But I'm looking at this one a little differently. As soon as I see Gullah Geechee Preservation report, I think culture. And then I think of Jen McEwen. And I think of opportunities of creating interest in what this community represents. And maybe that signage becomes a part of that. So I think there's a need to consider this somewhat openly and learn a little bit more about what is truly expected. And I'd like Jen McEwen in that conversation, because I think that there truly is an opportunity to display and educate in a way that would resonate with visitors and probably make some residents very happy. I know when I used to buy produce over at Saul Campbell's place, that was an experience. That was something that was different than going to Harris Teeter. And so I'm thinking that there's something about this conversation that we need to ponder a little bit longer. If there are no other comments, let's move on to number 10.
Please.
All right, this next one came from the Planning Commission meeting when they heard their annual traffic report. They suggested that we replace using the June traffic counts with the July traffic counts. This year, we went ahead and are doing both, but their recommendation is that in the future we look to use the July traffic counts instead of June.
Any thoughts, comments? If not, makes sense to me. Anybody object? Or Tammy, did you have a question? No? Okay. All right, let's move on.
Sure. This next one, number 11, is a clarification rather than a change in process. Single-family residential lots, except for within the buffers, trees aren't protected. The trees are only protected within the required buffers. But the LMO isn't clear on that. That's our process. And it's, that is the way the LMO is written. But like I said, it's not clear. So we get natural resource requests all the time for trees on single family lots that aren't within the buffer. So this would make it clear and make it easier for staff to be able to share that, that those aren't, that permits aren't required for that. So again, we're not changing anything in the process. Trees on single family lots are not protected except in the buffer. We're just clarifying that so it's clear to everybody in looking at the LMO.
I think we've had a situation where somebody had a really big, beautiful tree on a piece of property up in the Stony area, and we had to negotiate to save that. I don't remember the details. Am I understanding this correctly? So if somebody owns a single family lot and there is a significant tree on that property, the town cannot require that tree to be preserved?
If it's not in the buffer, that's correct.
David, I recall a case, if I can interrupt for a second, I recall a case that came before the BZA involving a lot up there on Chamberlain Drive, where they had a huge tree. And so we went round and round about that and finally gave a waiver as to setbacks and buffers so they could go ahead and build the house and preserve the tree at the same time. So there may be some merit in this. I always get squirrely, though, when I hear someone say, we don't have to protect the trees that are outside of the buffer. Somehow I wish we could have more tree protection rather than less. But I understand.
And I should clarify too. I mean, we certainly work with people when they come in, when they submit their plans, for single family homes. Most people want to preserve significant specimen trees on their lots, and so we work with them to try to do that as much as possible. It's simply that they're not required to, but again, most people want to. They see the value that those trees have on their property.
Well, if I have a straight road that's 1,200 feet long, and I'm subdividing it with 60-foot wide lots, and there are a significant number of trees on those lots, do I have to get a permit to cut them? They're not in the buffers and so on. So
right. It's a little bit. Sorry.
The point is that we are seeing development practices now that do not respect the sort of premise of balancing the environment with our development. And the sort of the core value of environmental stewardship is lost in tract housing. And I think that is a problem for us. And I'm just raising the question whether or not we should be so lenient as to relegate the significant tree decision to the developer in all cases.
Well, and I would add too, for subdivisions, if somebody wants to subdivide a property and they have significant or specimen trees on them, because that property isn't single family at the time, we do work to preserve those. So we have them try to create the lots and the road as much as possible to preserve and protect those trees, even requiring them to be put into open space or, making the buffers a little bit bigger where we can so that those are protected
You're right.
before the subdivision happens.
Well, I think that to the degree that we could put some teeth into the code that said specimen trees or something that would give us the option of having a conversation. But your point's well taken in terms of the subdivision. Any other thoughts on that particular item? Seeing none. Number 12.
Okay, so this one, recommends actually strengthening the language related to trees. So a couple of years ago, when we added significant trees to the LMO and provided a list of those trees and their sizes, we didn't also provide specific protection zones and trunk offsets for significant trees like we have for specimen trees. So that's what we would like to do here is add in a certain distance from the trunk that you can do work, that you can have impervious construction, similar but not the same as what we have for specimen. So it'd be a little bit less than specimen because these trees are significant rather than specimen, but still put those protections in place. Because while we called out significant trees and provided some protection in the LMO, there isn't any requirement right now that that developers stay a certain distance away from them when constructing.
I have no problem with that direction. Does anybody else? Okay.
Going in the right direction.
Number 13.
Okay, so this is recommending that we remove the requirement that staff provide a recommendation as part of our staff reports. As you're aware, we provide recommendations for any of our staff reports that go to boards and commissions and town council. In this case, we would still be doing the same level of staff review, still same amount of research, but we would remain neutral and allow the boards and the commissions to come to their conclusions based on the information that was provided in the staff reports, both from the applicants and from staff.
I have opinions on this one, but I'm interested in hearing others as well. Bill.
I would not be in favor of this. The reason is that we have a very good staff. They're very knowledgeable. And frankly, they may know more individually than the collective wisdom of an appointed commission. And I think by coming forward with their opinion and then challenged by others, what led to that opinion, that can turn into a learning experience for the reviewer that we would all benefit from. So I would encourage that to continue.
Others?
I tend to agree. Excuse me, go ahead.
Alex?
No, go ahead, Glenn.
Sorry, I butted in. I apologize for that. I agree with Bill. The staff member that has worked on a particular issue has a lot more detailed information about that issue. And rather than a board or commission that here's a presentation and that's it. And so I think that the staff recommendation is a valuable aspect of this reporting. Thank you.
Alex?
Yes, I agree that the staff needs to play a role in the recommendation. We put a lot of time and effort into our comprehensive plan, speaking more so from my experience on the Planning Commission. And I'm thinking that this is more of where this is coming from. In some cases, you can find elements of the comprehensive plan to either support an argument or to kill an argument. Okay. And I think it could put staff in a very uncomfortable position at times. Okay, so I think this is where this is really coming from. I'd like to see not only we make reference to a comprehensive plan, but maybe start to have a grading scale to go along with it. A little deeper than just the core values, but more in line with the goals and tactics. The last thing we want to have happen is folks are coming onto our boards and commissions and not able to use the toolbox that they have effectively. So I think this one doesn't deserve just a check off and say, let's continue to have staff make recommendation, but we discuss it to a degree to where we're using the opportunity of a new comprehensive plan, along with the strategic plan that we are going to, strap up here very soon. I think it's just important that we have folks that are serving in a volunteer capacity, just a little better equipped along the way.
Thank you. Amy, your comments?
So, and Bill have both said to have the wisdom and the experience of our staff and their impression of the information that they're bringing forward. Like Alex, I think I like the idea that has been employed recently, where the everything is related back to our plan, and it's noted in there that yes, we've checked with X, Y, and Z, and it makes all of these marks. I think that's an important addition to the paperwork that's been coming forward. I think that for the boards and commissions, it's also a great jumping off point for them to ask their own questions and delve a little bit deeper. So I don't know if that really helps out much with regard to this one, but I like hearing what staff has to say. Their experience is valuable to me. That additional checkoff has, I think, even improved that more. So I'd like to see it continue along that line, and maybe a reminder to all of us that it's our individual responsibilities to become as familiar as possible with what we're being presented with, so that we can ask the relative questions and make sure in our mind we're all aligned, and if not, suggest a different way and vote the way we see fit at that point. But for what that's worth, those are my thoughts.
Thank you. Terry, I've had conversations with the new town manager about this. I've had conversations with Sean over a period of a year or so. I think that we expect the town manager to hire people who are expert and have experience in areas that we probably, as elected officials, don't have that depth. So if that's the case, I look to staff to provide the evaluation, the assessment of opportunity or risk in any proposal. So it's not an expectation that staff is meant to support a position, but to give council the information and the pros and cons of a direction. To me, that would allow us not only to respect staff for its expertise, but would give us the responsibility to make the decision based on that good information. So I'm very strongly in favor of staff having the responsibility to put forward a really comprehensive presentation of pros and cons, risks, and so on of this, and then allow council to make a decision. I think in the past, and I'll use the Christian Academy as an example, I felt staff had a predetermined position, and the comprehensive plan was simply, as Alex was suggesting, used to support that position. That devalued, in my opinion, or discredited the staff's recommendation. I want the opposite to happen. I want staff to come forward to us and say, we've really looked at this, and there's some really good benefits, and this is what they are. But on the other side of the check is a list of demerits. That, to me, gives me confidence that staff is really doing a job that we want them to do. So with those comments, I would say staff continue to provide recommendations, but more than recommendations, as Alex suggested, more than recommendations as I suggested, and as the others have suggested. Number 14.
Okay, so this last one is to remove staff-granted waivers. This came up most recently as part of the discussion related to family compounds and family subdivisions, just starting to look at those waivers a little bit further. We have 11 right now in the LMO, and I should back up and say these, some of the waivers less formally were in the LMO prior to the rewrite, but really as part of the LMO rewrite in 2014, the majority of them were added. And so right now there's 11 waivers: access to street standards, adjacent street buffers, adjacent use and street buffers and setbacks, height, nonconformities, properties functioning together, stormwater, tree preservation, and wetland buffers. So in all of those cases, staff is able to provide a waiver based on criteria. Now, all of these are tied to criteria. There is there's an application that has to be filled out to go along with it before staff can make that determination. And then we also report back to the Board of Zoning Appeals at the chairman's request once a month on which waivers have been granted. But what we're proposing here is to remove staff-granted waivers from the LMO, and somebody would instead go to the BZA if they needed, flexibility in one of those standards.
Little history here. 2010, there was the Mayor's Task Force on the Island's Future. That effort was in response to the downturn in the economy, 2008. And it suggested that we ought to be a little bit more flexible in dealing with applications, permits, and so on. And so that actually occurred within the town hall. And the waivers that we are seeing today are coming in a very different environment. We are getting pressed in virtually every direction to expand the building footprint as well as the mass of units. And so I think that we are at a point now where it may be necessary to have stricter guidelines with less flexibility. Those are my thoughts. Others? Go ahead, Tammy.
I couldn't support this more. I think that as I guess it was someone had said, the pendulum has swung. I think that the description you just gave of the history is likely, perhaps at that time, it was warranted. At this point, I think the more restrictive approach is a better one, and a support for this is 100% from me.
Glenn?
Thank you. I think I tend to get more in the weeds on something like this, and I think I would like to be able to listen to a presentation about each particular item that a waiver can be granted. In some of them, it's more of an administrative matter than it is a policy matter. And so if that's all it is, then it's probably appropriate for there to be a staff waiver. On the other hand, if it gets into policy and island character and that sort of thing, clearly staff should not be granting a waiver. And I'd like to take the burden off of our staff, about having to make those recommendations.
I think you make a good point. There are different types of waivers, so good.
Sure.
Bill, you had your hand up at one point?
That's really much of the same. Waivers, leak out into policy sometimes pretty quickly, and I would like to see more of our involvement there.
All right, thank you. Alex, you have a comment?
Yeah, I agree that this is one we definitely need to get a handle on. But I too would like to have a little deeper conversation about it. I'm going to speak more directly to, of course, the Gullah Geechee recommendations. There's some items there that go right back to what you said, Councilman Ames. In 2010, we were reacting to a downturn in the economy and needed to provide more opportunity. Now, we may have accomplished some positives in that and learned some lessons along the way, absolutely. But I view where we are in regards to us saving a dying culture, particularly when it comes to land loss, as being just as crucial. So there may be some items there that we want to look at before we send it to a BZA decision. More dialogue is definitely needed in this area.
Okay, well, what I see is that we're asking for more information, Terry, on the setback buffer issues, access easements, and so on, that whole panoply of thoughts. And then number 14, get a little bit of get a presentation that speaks to the types of waivers that come before you as administrator, so that we can be a little bit more educated on those two items. I think we've given you pretty consistent direction on most of them. Is that clear?
Yes, I would agree. We've gotten great input. This was very valuable.
I would say because some of our positions are going to have pushback from segments of the community, it's going to be important for you, Terry, to try to create a calendar of how these things are going to move forward and when different stakeholders in the community can anticipate their particular subject is going to come before the LMO committee, Public Planning Committee, and Council. So the earlier you can do that, I think the better. We are taking strong positions that are different than what may have been in the LMO for a time, and I just out of respect want people to know what we're doing early enough for their ability to participate.
Yes, sir.
Any other comments from members of the committee? Bill, anything?
No, thank you.
All right. Is there and Terry, you're all set now.
I am. Thank you.
Good. Okay. I think if there are no staff reports, Terry, do you have anything else? Okay. Is there a motion for adjournment?
So moved.
Second.
All those signify by raising your hand. We
Thanks.
are adjourned. Thank you, and great meeting, guys. Appreciate it.